In a recent poll, the most popular choice was more action RPGs, and I think I can accommodate that, starting with this mini-series where you look at bite-sized batches of modern and retro action RPGs, with today's theme being the 5 most accessible competitors to the Diablo franchise, that will at least run smoothly on pretty much any modern system. Starting out, we're going to look at Path of Exile, an awesome and nowadays extremely complex action RPG that in its early days was touted as the true Diablo 3 since it captured the gritty and dark themes of its inspiration in the first and second Diablo games. That said, it deviates pretty heavily from the formula though, even at its core with a skill system that functions much like the materia in Final Fantasy VII rather than a tree, and an attribute system that uses a web-based progression in the form of passives that can be a bit overwhelming at first glance, and a fairly simple stat but very complex socket and crafting system approach to equipment. As time has gone on, this core system has been layered on with several seasonal additions that have made it a bit more bloated to dig into, as well as actually doubling its story length at the sacrifice of difficulty tiers over the years. It can be a lot to get into at first, but if you're willing to put in the time and energy, it can be a very engrossing and rewarding experience, and it offers one of the more expansive post-games of the titles on this list, though do expect to feel lost if you put the game down for a while between sessions and they introduce some new features. After that, we have probably the second most requested and also second most complex title on the list, and that is Grim Dawn, which barely inched its way onto this list above its predecessor. With a much more familiar skill system, doubly so if you've played Titan Quest before, it offers much more class-specific progression, albeit allowing you to dual class should you choose to fairly early on. What makes Grim Dawn complex though is two things. First, the devotion system, which sits fairly similar in complexity to Path of Exile's passive tree for its attributes, but this integrates itself much more into your active playstyle than those passive attributes, and the other complexity is the item system itself, which even by late normal you will have to be sifting through a minimum of a half dozen stats, if not twice that many, to decide if one piece of gear is better than another for your particular character. Overall though, Grim Dawn I feel captures more of the Diablo atmosphere, albeit in a more of a Victorian steampunk atmosphere. An interesting aspect of Grim Dawn is how it handles the randomization of the maps. Things are pretty much in the same place regardless of when you play through, but what routes you need to take are determined by where blockades spawn along the way, making it far more predictable than the more random Diablo-style games, but still keeping pathing interesting, and it keeps you engaged enough with the wide variety of foes, from humans to demons, not to mention beasts, insects, and everything in between, that it's actually quite fun. And while its postgame is far simpler than that of Path of Exile, it is most definitely more accessible to a player who wants to just enjoy it in their downtime. To give a more story-driven and less loot-driven option, we have the black sheep of the list, Shadow's Awakening, an entry into the Heretic Kingdoms franchise. The entire series offers this familiar combat with more story and puzzle-driven atmosphere. It offers much simpler experience when growing your characters in exchange for somewhat more complex engagement with the world. With fixed maps and choose-your-own-adventure approach to assembling your party, which is what composes your various class selections, this game relies on these choices to provide replayability rather than the hunt for best-in-slot gear. This is because your first big choice you make sets you down the path of 3 major story arcs, with your choices throughout the journey giving you even more differences in the minor story arcs. A really nice thing about this game is due to having a full roster that you swap between kind of on the fly in an exceptionally intuitive manner, you're never really going to be locked into playing a class or character you end up finding out you really aren't enjoying, since you can always just swap to a character that embodies entirely different playstyle if you wish. This is one of those few multi-character action RPGs, and probably one of my favorites, even if it costs us any form of actual multiplayer with it. To bring a bit more of a fresh flavor to the video, we have a game called Last Epoch, still in early access, so a lot of things might change. This is a good game to get in on the ground floor if you enjoy action RPGs, striking an exceptionally good balance between simple and complex to keep you engaged without being overwhelmed. It offers the variety of even the more complex titles on this list, but by presenting it in more bite-sized and controllable chunks, you encounter far less interface fatigue. Even later, whenever you get into the more complex mechanics, it never felt overwhelming or disjointed to me, which was definitely a problem early on for a number of the titles here. A bit of a drawback with this title is that it is indeed still early access, and things are regularly changing, and it still doesn't quite have integrated multiplayer or anything like that you can actually play with other people directly. Though they are actively working on that and it should be releasing soon, as well as expanding the game's post-game options if that's something you're interested in. And we've still yet to see how fair the monetization policy is going to be in the long run for the multiplayer aspect, though I wager it will be very similar to that of Path of Exile in regards to cosmetics and stash tabs after full release. And lastly, we have a game that is the most direct comparison to Diablo 2, and that is Torchlight 2. Developed by a team fairly split between the original Diablo 2 creators and the creators of a game called Fate, the Torchlight series definitely shows its pedigree from both of these titles, if you're experienced with them both at least. Though it is worth noting that while the first and second game were developed by this team, the third title was created by another company entirely and deviates from the formula quite a bit. Back to Torchlight 2 though, the intriguing thing is that its life cycle is uncannily similar to that of Diablo 2, with both having fairly decent single player experiences, similar progression, and even, as time went on, a fairly equally thriving mod community. Meaning, not only can you play through the core game in vanilla, but as you progress, you can explore mods either alone or with friends to take the game even further in the experience, with the only similarly modded game on this list being Grim Dawn, and that being fairly rare in the genre in modern days. It's actually a pretty big selling point for me. That said, the game is not without its drawbacks, since it's so similar to Diablo 2, it suffers from many of the same issues, in that there's only so much to do in the game without these mods, and it generally does just come down to clear speed as to how good you'll do whenever it comes to forming your endgame strategy. And that's the first 5 of many strong alternatives to the Diablo franchise, which we will have at least a few additional entries for, as well as for less Diablo-esque action RPGs. So what games would you like to see become part of the upcoming second entry into this series? I've got ideas, but maybe I've forgotten a gem along the way. Mention them down below, and it is worth noting I am working on much deeper dives into each of these games, and will for future games, with much more mechanical look at both their strengths, weaknesses, successes, and failures, and what I hope future action RPGs can take away from each of them. And as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and regular viewers that make all this content possible, and of course, keep gaming, have fun, peace out, this has been Alzorath, bye.